Hello, and welcome to the Albright Scholar for September 2021. My name is John Pankratz. I teach history at Albright, and each month it's my pleasure to welcome BCTV viewers and residents of Greater Reading to take a glimpse inside our learning community up here on North 13th Street, to look at the work being done by teachers and students, and to think about its impact on all of us. Well, another school year has begun. It's September, and Albright is doing its best to continue its mission of liberally educating our students. The pandemic has not gone away. We are pressing ahead, trying to achieve herd immunity and urging everybody in our community to be vaccinated. I hope you have been. We are teaching face-to-face in most cases. There are a few hybrid courses and a couple online ones as well, but most of us are in there working with our students up close and personal, or at least 6 feet away. I'm delighted today to welcome my colleague in the history department, Dr. Shane Dillingham, who's a new professor, well, fairly new professor, starting in his second full year of Latin American history. And we're doubly excited because Shane has just come out with a new book from Stanford University Press entitled Oaxaca Resurgent. And we're going to focus on that and talk about his teaching at Albright as well. Shane, welcome to the Albright Scholar.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Great. You can tell that I'm the senior member of the department because I have more detritus in my office than Shane does in his. Well,
I'm working on it.
Yeah, you'll collect it over time. Great, and then we can do archaeology among all the layers. This is a book you've been working on for quite a while. I think at least 10 years, and it concerns the Mexican state of Oaxaca. It examines indigeneity and thinking about indigeneity in that state. It's about educational reform. It's about economic development. It's about politics. It really covers a lot of bases. How did you get into this topic?
That's a great question, John, and thank you. The book that just came out here in August of this year, I'm really happy to have out in the world. And it is a project that I've been working on, as you say, for about 10 years. I think the easiest way to describe it is that when I was in graduate school, even longer than 10 years ago, I had enrolled in a Mexican history workshop in southern Mexico, as you say, in the state of Oaxaca, which is south of Mexico City, in between basically Mexico City, the state of Chiapas, and then Guatemala to the south. And so I was there in the summer of 2006, and basically as I was participating in this kind of, traditional academic seminar where we'd listen to guest speakers and read important historical texts together, we witnessed the annual teacher strike there. And so Oaxaca is a relatively rural place, not much of an industrial economy. And so the teachers and the teachers union in the state of Oaxaca is really the largest trade union in the state, and exercised a lot of political power. And so every spring the teachers would go on strike on May 1st, which is International Workers' Day. And then they would usually kind of quite quickly enter into negotiations with the government over pay and other kind of basic, workplace issues. And so traditionally, this was a relatively routine affair, but in 2006, it became historic precisely because it didn't follow those routines, right? And so what I saw was that instead of negotiating with the teachers, the governor at the time sent in riot police to remove the teachers from the town square. He had riot police firing tear gas from helicopters above the state capitol. And so this repression of this social movement kind of spurred on even more activism and calls for the governor's resignation. And so the book really starts there in 2006, trying to understand this big social conflict that was led not just by teachers, but in particular by indigenous teachers. Oaxaca is home to over 16 different indigenous cultures and languages. And so many of the leaders of that teachers movement were people who were Mixtec or Zapotec, Mije, and they were fighting both to get rid of the governor, but also for kind of a different type of society and for broader social reforms in Mexico. So the book kind of starts there with me trying to understand where that social movement came from. And I think as a historian, what I tried to do and try to do in the book is look at the kind of longer history of Oaxaca as a place to understand where that movement came from and kind of what was at stake in that conflict.
Yeah. It may be that some of our viewers have been to Oaxaca or at least heard of Oaxaca because it's famous as a beautiful location, as a site of glorious nature and archaeological fascination and ethnographic interest and that sort of thing. So tourists have been there a lot, and to see that underlying all that pleasure and good food is political upheaval and sort of long-term conflict between different factions or different parts between the state and different residents.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, John. I mean, I think in the last couple decades, you've seen Oaxaca become much more represented in terms of mainstream popular culture in the United States and beyond, right? So the Disney film, Coco kind of famously, and I think really effectively demonstrated one of Oaxaca's most important festivals, the Day of the Dead or Dia de los Muertos. Oaxaca's spirit, that is mezcal, its traditional alcoholic beverage, has become very popular internationally in the last few decades. And of course, Oaxacan food, mole, et cetera, has really experienced a resurgence. And so, I think a lot of people become familiar with Oaxaca because of the way it's kind of entered the mainstream culture in the last few years. And the other thing is Oaxaca is a place of large scale migration, right? And so of the, 3 or 4 million people who make up the state's population, a large number of those people have migrated to other parts of Mexico, but increasingly to other parts of North America, including the United States and Canada. And so
we have several students who are from Oaxaca.
Absolutely, yeah. And so today, I mean, and people describe it as such, as there's a kind of Oaxacan diaspora, right? There's Oaxacans who are on the East Coast, who are here in Redding, who are all up and down the West Coast, California, Oregon, the state of Washington, and even into Vancouver in British Columbia. And so, Oaxaca is a place that is, I think, really interesting and unique on its own, but it's also a place that kind of packs a punch in terms of cultural contributions across the world.
Yeah, and has for millennia in a sense as well. Researching a book on 20th century history, you have to rely on a combination of sources, don't you? You can't simply go to a library and read books or even documents about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think working on 20th century history is both exciting because it's a relatively recent history. You have, for example, people who are still alive, people who lived through the events of the mid-20th century, the 1960s, 1970s, and are eager to share their stories. But it's also somewhat of a challenge, right? Precisely because it is so immediate and people have deep investments in that material. If you were studying medieval history, nobody is going to kind of talk back to you and say, hey, you got that wrong, right?
Right.
But with kind of more contemporary history, people are rightly invested in the stories that we tell about that. And so for the book, what I tried to use was a combination of different sources. Some of them would be kind of more traditional sources that historians use, national archival collections. I visited the National Archives in Mexico City, which are actually housed in a 19th century prison that's been converted into an archive. And so the documents are literally held in the former cells of the inmates.
Do they keep the door open for you though?
They do, yes, they do keep they're called galleries, right? Just like you would have galleries in a prison. And so you consult the archives at a big table in the middle, but the archivists go to pick up the materials from the former cells. It's actually a kind of panopticon prison, if viewers have a sense of what that is, these geometric shape that would allow
see everything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The guards to be able to monitor everyone. And so I spent a number of years working in those archives, hanging out with the cats that the archivists keep, because they are trying to keep the mice at bay from the documents. And I think there, one of the interesting set of documents that I looked at was basically a series of reports from the Mexican federal agency, which would be the equivalent to the FBI in the United States, a domestic intelligence gathering agency. And so in 2000, the Mexican president, Vicente Fox, declassified all of those documents. And that was the first time that historians could go in and look at the documents of this federal spying agency. And so that agency kept files and reports on teachers, on government bureaucrats, on anthropologists who worked with indigenous communities. And so I used those files as one kind of window into the story. And then the other one, the other kind of main set of information that I used for the book was actually interviews, right? Interviews with historical participants, people who were involved in the history of indigenous education, development projects in Oaxaca, people involved in politics. And so I conducted, a couple dozen interviews with people, mainly Oaxacans, but some people in Mexico City who could help kind of flesh out the story of 20th century Oaxaca.
Right. How did you meet some of these interviewees? It's sometimes oral history is a challenge because you have to establish some sort of link and a level of trust in order for them to tell their stories, particularly if they're controversial stories.
Right. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, John. And as a foreigner, right, as an American who's researching and working in Mexico, there's a kind of extra level of scrutiny that oftentimes people applied to me, right? So people would ask, what is this gringo? What is this American want to do with our history? And so, I did try to share my own experiences in the United States of, I had myself been involved in some political activism around education and immigrant rights in the United States. And so I tried to share my own experiences as a way of kind of showing that I too was someone who was connected to these issues. But probably the most important way that I kind of connected with my interviewees and gained the trust of a network of education reformers and activists was through studying Mixtec or Tu'unsavi, one of the 16 different indigenous languages in the state of Oaxaca. And so I enrolled to study that class study that language over the course of 3 years. And Mixtec is a pre-Hispanic language. It's a language that predates European arrival. It's a tonal language, so it's a language that might sound to English speakers more like an Asian language, right? The same word can mean 3 different things depending on the tone in which you say it. And so that language training, I became, friends with my language instructors, and then they went ahead and introduced me to other Mixtec language activists and other teachers and people involved in education in Oaxaca. And so in that way, it was kind of, one relationship led to another. And that became really important in terms of the interviews that I ended up recording.
Right. And of course, language activism is a really important thing in Mexico because there are native speakers who continue to communicate using these pre-Hispanic languages. And it's vibrant and important because world languages have tended to crowd out and to submerge the thousands of ways that humans communicated before.
Right. I mean, so for example, this year, 2021 is the 500th anniversary of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is in 1521, the Spanish defeat the Aztec Empire, which was a large, powerful imperial force in the Valley of Mexico. And, so Mexico is marking that 500th anniversary this year, and there's exhibits in Mexico City, and the Mexican president recently asked the Spanish crown to apologize for the conquest. I think he also asked the Pope Francis, to apologize for the church's role in the conquest. But even though that the Aztec
You have
Empire,
to find then the right people to apologize to, as well, because there are plenty of people in Mexico who were part of the conquest.
Exactly. Yeah, no, right. This is what many Mexican historians, indigenous activists are debating right now, is exactly how we commemorate the conquest and its kind of complicated legacies. But as you point out, right, even though the Aztec Empire is defeated, the language of the Aztec Empire, Nahuatl, is a language that's spoken by over 1 million people today in Mexico and beyond. And so the languages and cultures of pre-Hispanic Mexico don't end with the conquest, right? But they persist in all sorts of ways. And I think that's kind of worth us paying attention to and valorizing, right? Just the way that I think in the United States, there has been important moves to embrace other languages other than English as important languages, bilingual education. You can go to Spanish language immersion schools or Japanese language immersion schools in the US. Mexico too has its similar kind of debates and discussions about how do we create a pluralist society where we respect not just Spanish, but also these different indigenous languages as of equal value, right? And that can contribute to our society.
In my own field of early American history, there's so many great researchers who are working on native languages and recovering those languages and using oral history, but also using various written sources kept by English invaders, but including native vocabulary and grammar, as well as belief and culture and stories. So
right, yeah, no, I think that is a really an important approach that scholars across different disciplines and fields are using, right, to try to take seriously those native languages, the documents, the sources that exist in those languages, and use them to tell a more accurate and more full picture of the historical experience.
Yeah, it's harder to do history every year because you need to know the truth, and the truth is sometimes a little bit elusive. Yeah,
that's right. Great.
Well, I had the privilege on Tuesday to watch you in action with really a wide range of scholars who are deeply interested in your work. The program in Latin American Studies at Princeton invited you to present Oaxaca Resurgent to a Zoom audience, and they enlisted a distinguished historian of Mexican anthropology, a British scholar of contemporary politics in Mexico, and then many people from the audience who chimed in with responses as well. And indeed, it seems that their whole year of Zoom seminars on indigeneity and development sort of take off from your book's themes. And so that was a great exchange that took place. So congratulations on writing a book that at least 80 people on Zoom are fascinated by.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, that was a really lovely event, and those 80 people included my mother, who was in attendance, front and center. But I do think that people are interested today, right, in 2021, in questions of indigeneity, right, which is a way of talking about indigenous peoples and cultures, right? What is the legacy of these colonial encounters, whether it's in Mexico or in the United States? How does it affect the world we live in today? Those indigenous peoples who are here, right, have engaged in all sorts of activism to say we are still here. You've seen, activism in the United States around the Dakota Access Pipeline, these campaigns about, you're standing on native land, and, land back campaigns to try to reckon with these historical injustices. And I think part of that is a response to the social movements like Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And so thinking about indigenous people's place in our contemporary societies, I think should attract a lot of attention, and is a way of us trying to think about well, what kind of society do we want in the future? How do we create a more just and egalitarian world? And I think thinking about the history of indigenous peoples is a kind of key component of that. And I'm excited that the book might be a contribution to that conversation.
Right. One of the things your respondents noted was that um, activism and radicalism in Oaxaca relates to radicalism throughout the hemisphere and other parts of the world, in fact. And I know that you yourself are teaching a course on Albright on a whole series of radical movements throughout the world, centered on 1968, but beyond as well. It's
yeah, no, I mean, one of the things I try to do in the book, which I think is important for us to think about generally, is connect Oaxaca's history with world history in the 20th century, right? If we live in a globalized world,
Yep.
We can use Oaxaca to think about that. And so, in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 1970s, of course, is a period of political and cultural change across the world. In the United States, the movement against the war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the rise of women's rights, and the gay rights movement. There's struggles by students, across Europe, and movements for decolonization in Africa. And a part of that kind of political effervescence is also an indigenous rights movement, right? And that in the United States takes the form of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, in which activists, seize Alcatraz. During this period, there's all sorts of struggles. American Indian activists seized the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices in Washington, D.C., as they are fighting for reforms and more attention to Native peoples. And so Oaxacan history kind of fits into that international dynamic. And I was pleased that, some of the conversation that we had this past week in discussing the book highlighted that part, right? That indigenous people are connecting with each other across borders, right? They were doing that in the 60s and 70s, and they're of course doing that today in 2021.
Yeah. I imagine those conversations are happening in your classes as well. Do you find that Albright students have a deep interest in Latin American history, or the history of indigeneity, or worldwide social movements?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a pleasure to teach at Albright, in the sense that I have students whose they and their families have connections all over the world, right? And they're connected here to Reading and the kind of greater Pennsylvania area, but they're also, when I teach a Latin American history course, I oftentimes, a plurality of my students, have connections to the Dominican Republic, to Puerto Rico, to Guatemala, to Haiti. And that really enriches the conversations that we can have, right? Because they share their own experiences or family connections. If their families fled, for example, the Civil War in Guatemala in the 1980s, that's a story that really enriches our in-class discussion. And then, of course, one of the ways that, as we talk about Native and Indigenous histories, one of the big discussions these past couple of years have been debates about historical monuments and statues, right? Whether it's the Confederate statues that were, erected throughout the U.S. South and even other parts of the United States, or the statues that exist, for Christopher Columbus, whether you're in, South Philly or in Bogota, Colombia, right? And so that is a subject that I think the students have a lot of interest in. And so, in this semester, we talking about the history of 1492, about this Italian explorer, Christopher Columbus, who arrives in the Caribbean and is working for the Spanish crown. And then, we looked at videos of, protesters calling for, Columbus statues to be taken down, and other protesters calling for, kind of Italian Americans calling for the defense of these statues. And I think it's a subject that the students find very interesting, right? And so I think the great thing about history is if we can connect our knowledge of history to contemporary debates and discussions, it can be a much more, profound conversation. And we can try to understand, well, when did this statue come up? Who put it there? What does it represent?
What do they mean by it?
And so I think Albright students are very invested in those conversations. And in the case of Columbus, I had students who are from Latin America who have a particular view of Christopher Columbus. I also had students who were from Philly, whose communities, some of them were interested in defending the statue. And that, I think, only adds to the conversations we can have in the classroom.
Really does. I thought about that topic yesterday. I accompanied some of the fashion students on their way to New York Fashion Week, where many Albright students presented. And we went by Columbus Circle there at the southwest end of Central Park, and Columbus is still up on this huge pedestal. But then if you go over towards the plaza at the east end of Central Park South, what do you see? You see William Tecumseh Sherman, who's a famous Civil War general that doesn't have statues in the South, not that I saw at least, whose middle name is that of a Native American leader, and who said some very nasty things about Native peoples in the years after the Civil War as well. So there's all sorts of monuments in New York City that we could talk about forever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In general, I find that history majors, but also just students in general, because we live in times of upheaval and self-questioning, are really interested in history courses. So I guess that's good for our work, but I think it might be good for civic life in the United States as well. That
no, I think you're right.
People.
Yeah, and I think it's also the kind of the moment that we find ourselves in, right? If maybe in years prior, people didn't feel like they were deeply connected to history or living through history, living through a pandemic, living through a kind of global crisis, that really underscores for people that, wow, history matters, that maybe my world is connected to a longer pattern in human affairs. And so I think it's become a much more interesting time to teach and study history, precisely because it feels like we're living through a historic moment, right? And it's, controversial. And, I had a student the other day who said, I'm tired of living through so much history, right? Because, it's we're living through difficult times. But, they were aware that
probably not the first person to think that. I think people might have been thinking that for at least a couple thousand years.
Exactly. So, but I do think, for those of us who are interested in studying and teaching history, these are important times.
I do too. Well, we've come to about the end of our half hour together, but it's been a fascinating conversation. I have the privilege of continuing that conversation with you in the years ahead, but we hope that our audience for the Albright Scholar enjoyed meeting you and learning more about your research and your teaching. We hope too that, so thank you, Shane, for being with me.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and the audience. And of course, if people want to reach out to me, you can find my information on the Albright website. I'm on Twitter. Happy to talk about the material we've talked about today.
Excellent. Excellent. We hope too that you'll join us next month for another installment of the Albright Scholar. So long.